The stars themselves seemed to dim, as if ashamed to witness what was coming. Across the galaxy's edge, the light of suns waned into bruised embers, and worlds once proud lay shrouded beneath veils of smoke and ruin. The Cadian Gate, the eternal bulwark that had endured against the tides of the Eye of Terror for millennia, trembled upon the brink of annihilation. In the silence between bombardments, one could almost hear the galaxy breathing its last, an empire's heartbeat faltering beneath the weight of betrayal, ambition, and time itself. This was not merely the fall of a fortress world. It was the unraveling of loyalty, the shattering of faith, and the final hour of men who had once believed themselves unbreakable. And before we march deeper into this tragedy, know this: we truly love and care for you, the listener. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. The skies above Cadia burned in hues of violet and red, storm-racked by the eternal presence of the Eye. Warp light bled across the horizon, staining the clouds as though reality itself wept. The walls of Casa Vortigern, one of the fortress bastions nearest the gate, groaned with the endless strain of bombardment. Yet the greater weight was borne within the heart of Lord Castellan de Aras Van, commander of the Cadian host and son of 1,000 years of oaths. From the parapets of the casa, he watched the void flicker with hostile light, his eyes tracing the silhouettes of imperial fleets embattled against the endless dark. The silence of his soul, however, was louder than the cannonades. Van was bred to loyalty. Cadia was not a world where choice flourished here. Men and women were sculpted from the cradle for war. Every heartbeat was synchronized with discipline, every breath dedicated to the Emperor's name. Yet in his marrow, a splinter had formed. He had fought long enough to feel the whisper of futility, to sense that for every victory wrung from chaos, another 1,000 abominations would follow. He had seen comrades turn to ash, friends broken in mind, and entire regiments swallowed by the warp. And lately, he had felt something colder. The suspicion that perhaps Cadia's eternal defiance was less a triumph than a sacrifice, demanded by an empire that no longer cared. Behind him, the banners of his command chamber swayed in the unnatural winds. Their fabric was stiff with soot, torn at the edges, yet they bore the Aquila still. To any who entered, they stood as testimony of defiance. To Van, they were shadows of the faith he had sworn to uphold. He turned from the parapet, his armor groaning at the joints, and walked into the chamber where his advisors waited. A dozen officers stood at rigid attention, their eyes betraying exhaustion. Beyond them, hololithic projectors painted the air with trembling runes of battlefield dispositions. Fleets strained, regiments bled, and the Eye of Terror swelled like an unblinking wound. The overseer from Terror spoke first. His voice was as sharp as a blade drawn in judgment. Lord Castellan, the High Lords demand Cadia hold at any cost. Reinforcements are en route. You will preserve the gate. Van's jaw tightened. Words of obedience hovered upon his tongue, yet another voice whispered deeper. At any cost, they say. Do they mean our cost, our children's cost, our world's cost? He bowed his head, concealing the storm in his eyes. Cadia will not break, he answered, though he could not tell if it was truth or defiance. When the meeting dispersed, a single figure lingered. Captain Serica Haldon, his most trusted subordinate, leaned her gauntleted hands upon the tactical table. Her eyes, dark and unyielding, searched his face. You doubt them, she said quietly, though not accusingly. You doubt Terra's will. Van did not answer at once. Instead, he allowed silence to coil around them, the hum of hololithic engines filling the air. At last, he exhaled. I doubt that we are anything more than stones in their walls. Stones they will let shatter if it buys them another breath. Haldan's gaze softened, though her voice was iron. Then we must hold for Cadia, not for terror. It was a noble thought, yet Varn felt the splinter twist deeper. Hold for Cadia, but to what end? What life remained here save endless war? He turned from her and dismissed the projection, leaving the chamber bathed in half-light. Alone once more, he pressed his hand against the cold stone of the wall, as if seeking the pulse of the world itself. Cadia, ever steadfast. Cadia, that had given all, could even such a world endure forever? Night bled into day, though such distinctions meant little beneath the warp-lit sky. Reports arrived of new incursions, cult uprisings within the casas, and fleets lost in the void. Each word was another weight upon Varn's spirit, yet what unsettled him most was the dream. He had begun to dream of immortality. Not the cold promise of glory enshrined in memory, but a terrible vision. Himself unchanging while centuries passed. His flesh turned to steel, his soul chained to eternity. In the dream, he stood as the gate itself, unyielding, eternal, and utterly alone. He would not die, but neither would he live. When he woke from such visions, sweat froze upon his brow, and his hands shook despite his iron discipline. Was it temptation from chaos, or the echo of some truth he dared not name? Men were mortal, empires fragile, yet the whispers of eternity lingered in the cracks of his mind. Immortality was horror, but mortality was futility. Between the two, where could he stand? On the 7th night of siege, the first betrayal struck. A courier was found slain within the Caesar's vaults. Vital intelligence stolen. Suspicions spread like wildfire. Every officer's loyalty questioned. Varn gathered his inner circle, his voice hard but his eyes weary. The enemy is not only beyond the walls. It is within. We will root it out, or Cadia will fall before the battle is even joined. Yet, even as he spoke, he wondered if the rot had begun in him. He stood again upon the walls, staring into the void where the enemy gathered in endless numbers. The stars were dying, their light smothered by warp-born storms. He clenched his fists, the weight of every oath pressing down. Could loyalty survive when faith itself eroded? Could Cadia stand when its defenders were torn between survival and duty, between immortality and the grave? As the first great salvo lit the horizon, turning night to flame, Varn whispered to himself words no Cadian should ever speak. What if the Emperor does not watch? What if he never did? The cannons answered with thunder. The fortress cities of Cadia rose like jagged teeth from a scarred earth. Their black stone walls older than memory, their foundations sunk deep into bedrock that had withstood 10,000 storms. Every tower was scarred, every gate dented by wars past, yet still they stood, grim and unyielding. Within, discipline thrummed like a second heartbeat. Cadia was not a world where people lived. It was a world where they endured. Children learned their first words alongside the cadence of orders. Mothers raised their sons, knowing most would fall before adulthood, and fathers taught their daughters to measure worth, not in years, but in battles survived. It was a place where loyalty was not a choice, but the marrow in their bones. Lord Castellan Varn walked the avenues of Casa Vortigern at dawn, accompanied by the slow tramp of his honor guard. Civilians bowed their heads as he passed not out of reverence, but out of the weary respect Cadia gave to those who bore its burdens. He looked into their eyes and saw the reflection of his own soul, exhausted, disciplined, and waiting for the next bombardment. They did not cry. They did not plead. They stood as Cadia had always stood. And yet, behind their silence, Varn thought he glimpsed something dangerous. Resignation. The fortress city breathed with routines that never faltered. At dawn, drill yards thundered with the march of new recruits. Children scarcely beyond their 10th year drilled with wooden rifles until their hands blistered. By noon, Manufactoria roared to life, churning out munitions and flak plating, the air thick with smoke and sweat. At dusk, the shrines filled with silent worship, soldiers kneeling before the Aquila in rows like stone statues, their lips murmuring litanies even as their eyes remained hollow. All of Cadia's life was preparation for its death. Within this rhythm, Varn's thoughts turned again to loyalty. The overseer from Terra, Master Ariston Kale, had taken up residence in a fortified spire that overlooked the Casa. He wore robes of black silk, trimmed with the gold of authority, and his every gesture spoke of one who believed himself above the world he had come to judge. In council, Kale's words were sharp and precise, yet to Varn they rang hollow. The overseer spoke always of duty to Terra, of sacrifices owed, of the Emperor's glory, but never once had Varn seen him speak to the people of Cadia. Never once touched the black stone walls that had drunk so much blood. It was Kale who now pressed for more troops to be drawn from the Casas, stripping Manufactoria workers and shrine keepers alike. Every able hand must hold a rifle, he declared, voice ringing in the war council. Cadia does not live to work, it lives to fight. And fight it shall, to the last child if need be. General Torvain Strass, Varn's rival and equal in rank, stood at the opposite end of the chamber. His armor gleamed, polished despite the soot, his medals arrayed with deliberate precision. Strass was a man who thrived on order and appearances. He bowed his head to Kale's decree, his voice smooth as steel. Terra speaks wisely. Let us give all we have, lest Cadia be remembered only in ruin. Varn's hand curled into a fist beneath the table. He knew Strass too well. Behind that polished veneer lay ambition sharp enough to wound. Strass sought favor with Terra, sought to rise beyond Cadia itself, perhaps to win a command among the stars. He would strip Cadia bare if it won him a title, and Kale would oblige him gladly. The only voice of resistance came from Captain Halden, standing by Varn's side, her eyes burned with defiance. You would gut the Cassars themselves. You would strip them of hands that forge their defense, that keep their spirit alive. Soldiers are not made in a day, my lords, and loyalty cannot be commanded, like a parade ground drill. If you break the people, you break Cadia. Kale's eyes narrowed. You forget your place, Captain. But Varn did not rebuke her. Instead, he raised his hand, silencing the chamber. Enough. Cadia will fight, but Cadia will also live. A world without spirit cannot endure, no matter how many rifles you place in its hands. His voice was calm, yet his heart thundered. He knew he was making an enemy of Kale, and perhaps Strass as well. But some line had to be drawn, or else Cadia was already lost. When the council dispersed, Strass lingered. He approached Varn with the false warmth of a comrade. You speak with conviction, Castellan, but conviction will not hold the walls. Terra demands sacrifice. You and I know this. If you hesitate, you will doom us all. Varn met his gaze, reading the unspoken challenge there. And if I do not hesitate, Strass, what then? Will Cadia survive because you won Terra's favor? Or will it fall, as all things must, while you polish your medals? Strass's smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened. We shall see, old friend. That night, Varn walked the walls alone. The air reeked of ozone from the endless bombardments, and the warp glow from the eye painted the horizon in sickly hues. He thought of Kale's cold words, of Strass's ambition, of Halden's loyalty. He thought of the people who bowed their heads in silence, and the children drilling with wooden rifles. Cadia was strong, yes, but strength alone could not mend the fractures spreading like cracks in stone. As he stood there, a runner approached, breathless with haste. "My lord, another incident. The barracks of the 7th Regiment. Ammunition stores sabotaged. Casualties mounting." Varn closed his eyes. The seeds of betrayal were no longer whispers, they had taken root. Somewhere within Cadia's walls, an enemy moved unseen, feeding on suspicion, eroding faith. And still, above them all, the eye of terror loomed, watching with patient hunger. He descended into the depths of the city, into the barracks where smoke still hung in the air. Soldiers moved like shadows, dousing fires, carrying the wounded. Their faces were pale but silent. No cries of despair, no curses upon fate. Cadia did not weep, but Varn, walking among them, felt the weight of their silence as accusation. Was he protecting them or leading them to slaughter? In the flicker of firelight, he saw one child soldier clutching a wooden rifle. Its barrel splintered, her face streaked with ash. She looked at him, not with fear, but with expectation, as though he held all answers. Varn knelt beside her, placing a gauntleted hand on her shoulder. He wanted to tell her Cadia would endure, that the Emperor watched, but the words lodged in his throat. He could not lie, not tonight. Instead, he whispered, "Stand strong," and she did. She rose, silent, her eyes cold as stone. Cadia's children did not cry, but their silence would echo forever. The wind over Casa Vortigern's walls had a taste of iron now. Even the air seemed scorched, scoured by unseen currents from the eye. Lord Castellan Varn stood at the edge of the parapet, his cloak snapping in the warp-tainted breeze. Below, the fortress city pulsed, with activity. Convoys of munitions trundled through narrow streets, shrines flickered with half-extinguished candles, and the mustering yards thrummed with thousands of boots drilling in unison. It was the rhythm of Cadia's life. Yet to Varn, it no longer felt like life. It felt like the tremor before collapse. He had not slept since the sabotage of the 7th Regiment. Reports arrived hourly, more cult symbols uncovered in the lower habs, whispers of officers gone missing, shipments miscounted. The seeds of betrayal had germinated into roots. His nights were filled with dreams of chains and iron gates, of himself turned into something beyond flesh, watching the centuries crawl by while Cadia crumbled. Each dawn he woke hollow, his armor heavier on his shoulders. On this morning, General Strass requested a private audience. Varn received him in a small chamber above the walls, where the sound of the city came muted through stone. A single lumen cast their shadows long across the table between them. Strass looked immaculate as always, his armor polished to a muted sheen, his posture a portrait of composure. Yet his eyes flicked once, almost nervously, toward the locked door before meeting Varn's. "I have come," Strass said softly, "because the time for half measures is over." Varn studied him. "Speak plain, General." Strass leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "We cannot hold the gate as terror commands. Reinforcements are a lie. The High Lords have abandoned us. You know this as well as I. But there is another path." Varn felt his pulse quicken. Another path. An armistice. The word hung in the air like a forbidden icon. There are envoys, unseen, but present, offering terms. If we open certain corridors, If we stand aside at a chosen hour, Cadia will be spared the full wrath of the Eye. Our people will live. Our world will remain. Varn's stomach turned cold. You speak of dealing with them, with chaos. Strass did not flinch. I speak of survival. Tell me, Castellan, what loyalty owes us now? We have bled for the Imperium for 10,000 years, and still they send decrees, not armies. They will watch us burn from afar. Why should our children die for their throne? We can save them. The chamber seemed to shrink around them. Varn's hands tightened on the edge of the table. He wanted to shout, to condemn Strass as a traitor, yet his throat closed on the words. In the long nights, had he not thought the same? Had he not wondered whether the Emperor still watched, whether Terra still cared? And always, in the corners of his dreams, the whisper of eternity, cold, unending, and waiting. You would make a pact with the Eye, Varn said at last, his voice low. I would make a pact to survive, Strass answered. Call it what you will. I have seen their power. They offer immortality not as corruption, but as strength. They offer Cadia a future beyond this slaughter. You have felt it too, haven't you? His eyes glinted with something like pity. I can see it in you. The doubt, the temptation. Varn rose, the motion sharp, his armor scraping the chair. You will not speak this blasphemy in my presence. But Strass did not retreat. He stood as well, his tone turning urgent. Think of the children in the drill yards. Think of Halden, your loyal captain. Think of the people who look to you for deliverance. Will you throw them into the furnace to keep faith with a throne that has already forsaken you? Varn's heart hammered. Images flooded his mind, the child soldier clutching the splintered rifle, Halden's defiant gaze, Cale's cold decrees, the endless warp storms clawing at Cadia's sky. He felt as though he stood at the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss that promised both doom and salvation. He forced his voice steady. Leave. Now. Strass straightened, his expression smoothing back into composure. I will leave, he said softly, but the offer stands. When the hour comes, remember who tried to save this world. He bowed with a mocking hint of respect and departed, leaving the chamber heavy with his absence. Varn remained standing, breathing hard. He pressed his palms to the cold stone of the wall, feeling the vibration of distant artillery. In the silence that followed, he realized he was trembling. Was it rage or fear? Halden found him there some time later. She stepped into the chamber without announcement, reading his posture with a soldier's instinct. He's been here, she said simply. Varn did not turn. You knew? I suspected, she replied. Strass's eyes have been elsewhere for months. And Cale feeds him every excuse to reach for power. She paused. What did he offer you? Varn closed his eyes. A way to save Cadia. Halden came to stand beside him. Her armor was unpolished, her gauntlets scarred, her face drawn but steady. There is no saving Cadia by surrender, she said quietly. You know that. Do I? Varn whispered. I have led men into slaughter for decades. I have buried more than I can count. Perhaps Strass is right. Perhaps loyalty is just another name for madness. Halden turned to face him fully. Loyalty is all that stands between us and the Eye. Without it, we're already lost. Her words struck something deep. But they did not banish the shadow. Instead, the shadow deepened, curling around his thoughts like smoke. He imagined immortality again, not as a gift, but as a chain, to live forever, to guard forever, while Cadia withered, to outlast his own soul. And yet, another part of him whispered, better chained than dead. That night, he walked the undervaults of the casa alone. The air there was damp, echoing with distant machinery and the drip of unseen leaks. Murals carved into the stone showed Cadia's history, victories won, sieges repelled, heroes fallen. He ran his fingers across a relief of an ancient Lord Castellan, standing before the gate, his face eroded by time but his stance defiant. How many had stood here before him? How many had chosen loyalty and perished? How many had been offered what Strass now offered and refused or accepted? A faint sound made him pause. In the shadows ahead, a figure knelt at a small shrine, whispering words he could not catch. Warp light flickered faintly across their hands. When Varn stepped forward, the figure vanished into a side corridor, leaving only the faint scent of incense and something colder, like rust. Even here, in the deepest halls, the eye's whispers had reached. He returned to his quarters before dawn. Outside, the sky was a boiling bruise, lightning crawling across the warp clouds. Reports lay upon his desk, unread. His reflection stared back at him from the window, gaunt, eyes hollow, a man caught between duty and damnation. He thought of Strass's words. He thought of Haldan's. He thought of the Emperor's silence. He pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered to no one, "How much longer can we stand?" Beyond the walls, the eye pulsed with patient hunger. The black stone of Cadia's walls had always been his horizon. As a boy, Dearus Varn had marched the drill yards of Casa Kraf, boots too large for his feet, rifle heavier than his arms. He remembered the cadence of shouted orders echoing between monolithic barracks, the sting of winter wind across his face, and the thunder of artillery in the distance like a lullaby. Childhood on Cadia was not measured in games or lessons, but in formations and endurance. He had known no other sky but warp-stained clouds, no other future but the uniform waiting for him. Loyalty was not taught to him. It was grafted into his marrow with every oath, every scar, every friend buried without a marker. Now, decades later, those memories rose unbidden as he stood in the Hall of Oaths, a vaulted chamber deep within Casa Vortigern, where ancient banners hung stiff with centuries of soot. Torchlight flickered on carved reliefs of Cadian history, regiments arrayed against daemons, generals standing unbowed, heroes dying at the gate. He had come here seeking counsel, not from terror, but from someone older than his command. In the center of the hall waited Marshal Ardent Kell, his former instructor, and now a stooped, silver-haired figure, wrapped in a greatcoat, worn thin at the elbows. Kell's eyes were still bright, though ringed with the weight of years. He had trained Varn from boyhood, hammering discipline into his bones with a voice like gravel. When Varn approached, Kell's hand rose in the old salute. "You walk these halls too seldom, Castellan," he rasped. "The stones still remember you." Varn gave a faint, weary smile. "Perhaps they remember a better man." Kell gestured for him to sit on one of the worn benches beneath the banners. "Speak. I can see the cracks in you, boy. Don't think the armor hides them." Varn sat, gauntleted hands resting on his knees. He found it strangely easy to speak here, as though the walls themselves had heard every confession. "The world frays, Marshal. The people grow tired. My officers quarrel. The overseer demands sacrifices that will hollow us. And now Strass whispers of survival by any means." Kell's gaze sharpened. "By any means?" Varn hesitated. "He speaks of parley with the enemy, of corridors opened, lives spared. He calls it survival." The old marshal spat onto the stone floor. "I trained you to know better than that. There is no survival in the eye's promises. only damnation. You may live, but not as yourself. You may keep Cadia, but not as Cadia. It will be a husk wearing your colours. Varn lowered his eyes. And yet, how many of our children must we burn to keep the husk untainted? We've given everything, Marshal. Perhaps too much. Kell leaned forward, his voice like iron scraping stone. To falter now is to invite damnation. Remember this, Daearus. Loyalty is not a comfort. It is a chain. But some chains hold the world together. Break them, and you fall with everything you tried to save. The words struck deep. Varn nodded slowly, though the splinter in his soul twisted. He had worn those chains his whole life. He had believed in them. Yet now, they felt heavier than the world itself. When he left the hall, the fortress city greeted him with another day of siege. Artillery thundered from the distant plains, and voxcasters blared drill hymns to mask the unease creeping through the ranks. Yet, the cracks were spreading. Reports arrived of supply convoys vanishing between casas. Reinforcements promised from the outer bastions, delayed without reason. Auspex readings altered. Casualty lists rewritten. On the surface, everything functioned. Beneath, rot gnawed. Halden met him on the steps of the command spire, her expression tight. Another discrepancy, she reported. Third Company's ammunition tallies falsified. Someone's moving shells where they shouldn't be. Varn took the slate from her hands. The numbers danced before his eyes like mocking runes. Do we know who? Not yet, she said. But it's someone high enough to bypass standard checks. Someone protected. He exhaled slowly. Chaos doesn't need to breach our walls. It only needs to hollow us out from within. They ascended to the command chamber where Kale and Strass awaited. The overseer's face was a mask of disapproval, his robe immaculate as ever. Lord Castellan, Kale began, our situation worsens. Reinforcements from Casa Dravik have been delayed due to complications. We must redistribute munitions to hold the front lines. Varn's gaze flicked to Strass. The general's expression was bland, but a glimmer in his eyes betrayed satisfaction. And how convenient, Varn murmured. Strass spread his hands. We all serve Cadia, my lord. Accusations help no one. Halden's jaw clenched, but Varn silenced her with a glance. He turned back to Kale. We will hold the lines, but we will not strip the casas bare. If we do, we may win a battle and lose our soul. Kale's lips tightened. Cadia's soul is the Emperor's to command. Varna almost laughed at that, a hollow sound that did not escape his throat. So, Terra says. He replied softly. The council broke apart, each member retreating to their tasks. Yet Varn felt the invisible hand of chaos pressing more firmly now. It was not a physical presence, not a voice in his ear. It was a shifting of currents, supplies misrouted, orders misinterpreted, allies delayed, a pattern of erosion, subtle and patient. That night, in his private quarters, he opened the small wooden box he had carried since youth. Inside lay a strip of Cadian soil sealed in glass, a keepsake from the drill yard, where he had first taken the oath. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight. Chains of duty, Kell had called it. Without them, nothing stood. With them, perhaps nothing survived. Outside, the eye of terror pulsed like a wound. He imagined it watching him, not with eyes, but with endless hunger. Perhaps chaos did not need to tempt him at all. Perhaps it only needed to wait for the moment his chains broke under their own weight. He set the soil back into its box and closed the lid. Somewhere in the casas below, a shipment was being diverted, a message doctored, a loyalty tested. The walls of Cadia still stood, but their foundations trembled. Varn whispered into the darkness, "How long before the gate falls?" The silence did not answer. The sky above Cadia no longer resembled a sky at all. It boiled like a living bruise, clouds sheared open by cracks of violet lightning, warp fire bleeding into reality. Each detonation of the Eye of Terror cast a sickly glow over the fortress cities, turning their black stone walls into silhouettes against a shifting curtain of unreality. The storms were not weather, they were omens. Each flash of light carried shapes. No mortal eye should see fleeting silhouettes of wings, chains, and screaming mouths, until even the most disciplined soldiers looked upward in silence, wondering if the end had already begun. Lord Castellan Varn stood on the highest parapet of Casa Vortigern, his cloak snapping in the electric wind. Below him, the city's avenues crawled with convoys of munitions and columns of troops. Above, the warp storm rolled closer with every hour. His gauntleted hands gripped the stone as though to anchor himself to something still solid. He had spent his life preparing for war, but not for this. This sense of reality unspooling, of faith dissolving like ash in water. Behind him came the sound of boots, measured but hesitant. He did not turn. "Halden," he said, his voice low. "What news?" Captain Serica Halden stopped a few paces from him. Her armor was streaked with soot, her hair damp with the warp-charged mist. For a moment she did not answer. Then she said, quietly, "Not news. Confession." Varn's brow furrowed. He turned at last to face her. "Confession?" She met his gaze, eyes dark and unsteady. "I've seen it, my lord. Not in a dream, not in fear, in visions." Her hands clenched at her sides. Cadia, broken. The gate torn open. Our banners burning in the streets. I saw you standing amid the ruin, not dead, but... The wind hissed around them, carrying faint whispers like voices half-remembered. Varn's stomach tightened. "You've been touched by the warp?" "I don't know what touched me," she said. "But the images are clear. The eye shows me what is coming, and I can't keep it hidden any longer. You must decide, act on it, or silence me before the others find out." For a heartbeat, the parapet felt like the edge of a cliff. Varn searched her face for treachery, but found only anguish. This was the woman who had stood by him against Kale, who had defied Strass to his face. Yet here she was, confessing to visions that could mark her as tainted, even damned. He spoke carefully. "Tell me everything." Halden stepped closer, lowering her voice, though the storm howled. "In the visions, the eye flares like a sun, and the walls of Cadia crack. Strass kneels before something vast. Kale vanishes into shadow, and you stand at the gate itself, but your eyes are not your own. You are immortal, yet hollow, a sentinel without soul." Varn's throat went dry. It was the same nightmare that had haunted him for months. Immortality as a chain, eternity as a curse. "You risk execution speaking this," he said. "I know," she whispered. "But if the visions are true, then secrecy damns us all." Lightning flared, casting their shadows long across the stones. Varn turned back toward the storm, his mind a storm of its own. Was this chaos sowing doubt through his most trusted aid? Or was it a warning, a chance to act before doom closed in? Every instinct trained into him screamed to denounce her, to silence the contagion before it spread. But another voice whispered, "She is the only one still honest with you." Below them, a siren wailed a low rising note, that signaled yet another incursion in the lower casas. Holden flinched, but did not step back. "Decide," she said. "Do I continue to serve you, or do you hand me to Cale and his priests?" Varn closed his eyes. In his mind he saw Kel's stern face in the Hall of Oaths, warning him that to falter was to invite damnation. He saw Strass leaning across the table, offering survival at the price of loyalty. And he saw Halden, the one person whose loyalty had never wavered, standing at the edge of a death sentence to bring him a truth he did not want to hear. He opened his eyes. "You will serve me still," he said. "But speak of these visions to no one else. Not yet. If they are a warning, I will need them. If they are poison, I will contain them." Relief flickered across her face, though it did not erase the fear. "As you command." "Come," he said, turning from the parapet. "There's work to be done." They descended into the command spire, where the atmosphere was heavier than the air above. Reports lay scattered across the table, like fragments of a shattered mirror. Reinforcements from Casa Dravik delayed again. Vox channels jammed at critical moments. Shell counts altered mid-transfer. Each discrepancy alone was minor. Together, they formed a pattern Varn could no longer ignore. Cale stood at the far end of the room, murmuring into a data slate, his face unreadable. Strass lounged near the hololith, eyes glinting in the green light of projected troop movements. They looked up as Varn entered, Holden at his side. "Another incursion?" Cale asked blandly. Varn ignored the question. "We are being hollowed out," he said, voice low but carrying. "Sabotage, delays, doctored reports. Someone is cutting Cadia apart piece by piece. If this continues, the gate will fall without a single breach in the wall." Cale's expression remained smooth. "Strong words, Castellan. Do you have evidence?" Varn stared at him until the overseer shifted slightly under the weight of his gaze. "Evidence is being erased as quickly as it appears," he said. "But the pattern is there." Strass spoke up, his tone almost gentle. "Perhaps the pattern you see is only the strain of command, my lord. Even captains dream strange things under warped skies." His glance slid toward Halden like a blade. Halden stiffened, but said nothing. Varn felt her tension, like a wire beside him. He forced his voice even. "Dreams or not, the facts remain. Reinforcements delayed. Munitions diverted. Loyal officers disappearing." Cale closed his data slate, then rooted out. "That is your duty. And yours," Varn said. "Cadia does not belong to Terra's decrees alone." Silence stretched. The hololith flickered, showing the eye pulsing closer like a wound. In that moment, Varn realized the room itself had become a battlefield. Words as weapons, loyalties shifting like sand. He felt the invisible hand pressing at the gate. Not from outside, but from within. Each subtle betrayal another finger closing around Cadia's throat. When the meeting ended, Varn dismissed Halden last. She hesitated at the door. "You should hand me over," she said quietly. "It would make you stronger in their eyes." "No," Varn replied. "They already doubt me. I will not give them truth to replace their suspicion." Her eyes met his, dark with both gratitude and dread. "Then we're both already marked," she whispered, and left. Varn remained alone in the command chamber. The hololith cast ghostly light across his face, making his reflection seem older, almost spectral. Outside, the storm raged louder, warp light clawing at the bastions. Every face around him might hide treachery now. Even his own might hide it from himself. He laid his hands flat on the table, feeling the tremor of distant artillery through the stone. Chains of duty, Kel had said. Break them, and you fall. Keep them, and they crush you. Between those choices lay only the eye. Above the fortress, the warp storm flared brighter, as if in answer. Dawn broke on Cadia, without light. The warp storm swallowed the sun, leaving the sky a churning bruise. From the parapets of Kasser Vortigern, Lord Castellan Varn watched columns of smoke rise from the outer bastions where the night's fighting had raged. Vox traffic came in fragments, half messages. Broken cries, coordinates shifting like mirages. In the streets below, soldiers moved with mechanical precision, faces grey from exhaustion, but still silent, still disciplined. Yet the silence no longer felt like strength. It felt like a wound sealed over too soon, infection festering beneath. Captain Halden approached, helm under one arm, eyes shadowed. Another gap opened on the western approach, she reported. We sent the 12th to plug it. But... She hesitated. But what? Varn's voice was flat. They never arrived. He turned to her sharply. Lost? Diverted, she said. Orders countermanded from higher authority. The Vox record shows Strass's seal. Varn's jaw tightened. Strass had crossed from whisper to action. Show me. She handed him a data slate. The sigil was clear. Redeployment of the 12th to secure supply convoys, supposedly threatened by cultists. But Varn had no such report. He felt heat crawl up his neck. He's stripping my front to guard his own flank, he muttered. While the gate bleeds. Halden's mouth pressed thin. I warned you he was moving pieces. Varn exhaled slowly, forcing his temper into stillness. Find out what's truly happening with those convoys, quietly. If Strass is carving himself a fortress at our expense, I need proof. She hesitated. There's something else you should know. His eyes flicked up. Now, her voice dropped. The visions, they've changed. Last night, I saw Cadia burning from within. Not just Strass kneeling, but me with a blade in my hand, standing over you. I don't know if it's a warning or a trap, but you needed to hear it. For a moment, the chamber seemed to tilt. Varn stared at her, searching for treachery, but again found only anguish. Even his most loyal companion carried darkness now, perhaps. Chaos whispered through her dreams, perhaps some deeper truth. He wanted to tell her to leave, to lock herself away until the siege ended. Instead, he said quietly, You're still here. That matters. She bowed her head, but her hands trembled as she took the slate back. For now, she murmured, and left to follow his orders. Varn stood alone, the weight of her confession pressing harder than Strass's betrayal. Was there anyone left untouched? Or was the eye reaching through every crack, turning loyalty into rot? Later, in the War Council chamber, Strass made his move openly. Before Kale and a cluster of junior officers, he presented a new deployment plan, one that would withdraw 2 entire regiments from the gate's defense to secure critical infrastructure. His tone was calm, his charts precise. But the meaning was clear. He was abandoning the front to fortify his own bastion. Varn let him finish, then rose slowly. General Strass, he said, voice like stone. Those regiments are the gate's spine. Without them, the enemy will pour through before nightfall. Strass spread his hands in feigned innocence. Better a controlled retreat than a total collapse. These are my troops, Castellan. I will not see them thrown away for terror's vanity. Kale's eyes flicked between them, calculating. Gentlemen, Varn cut him off. There will be no retreat. Not while I command. Strass's smile thinned. Then command your own. Mine will hold where I place them. A murmur rippled through the officers. This was no longer subversion hidden in data slates. This was open defiance. Varn's gauntlets creaked as his fists closed. He thought of drawing his sidearm, of ending the betrayal here and now. But the chamber was full of eyes, and he had no proof Strass colluded with chaos. If he killed him without cause, the army might fracture at once. He forced his voice even. "You are relieved of field command pending investigation." Strass laughed softly. "You have no such authority." "I do now," Varn said, and signaled to two guards. They hesitated just long enough to show where their loyalties wavered, then stepped forward. Strass did not resist. He only leaned close as they took his arms and whispered, "You think you're winning. You're only breaking the last bonds that hold this world together." After he was gone, the chamber felt colder. Cale's expression was unreadable, but his silence was consent enough. The officers bent over their charts again, avoiding Varn's eyes. He felt the corrosion inside him deepen, as though each necessary act left another scar on his soul. That evening, Halden returned with her report. "The convoys Strass claimed to protect," she said. "They're empty." He built a perimeter around a private bunker stocked with food, fuel, and passage codes. If the gate falls, he meant to escape. Varn's hands trembled as he took the data. "And how many of our soldiers does he have still loyal?" "Enough to fight if you push too hard," she said. "Enough to make a massacre inside our own walls." He stared at the slate until the numbers blurred. "We're being devoured from within, and He broke off, realizing what he was about to say. Halden tilted her head. "And you?" He looked up at her, the words like ash. "I may have to do the same. To betray someone. Or myself." She stepped closer. "Explain." "The gate will not hold if we're divided," he said. "I can crush Strass now, declare him traitor, purge his supporters, but the fighting will tear us apart. Or I can make a bargain with him, feed him what he wants, sacrifice some part of my command to keep the illusion of unity. Either way, I betray someone, our soldiers, our oaths, or my own conscience." Halden's face was pale in the dim light. "Then decide which betrayal leaves something left to save." He turned away, unable to answer. Outside, the warp storm cracked open, spilling violet fire across the horizon. In its glow, he saw the silhouettes of Cadian banners, whipping like tattered wings. Somewhere in those streets, children still drilled with wooden rifles. Somewhere, priests still whispered litanies to a silent emperor. And somewhere, chaos watched, patient as the tide. Night fell, like a curtain of ash. Varn sat alone in his quarters, a single lumen casting his shadow long across the floor. On the desk lay two orders, unsigned, one to arrest Strass and seize his troops, one to authorize a redistribution that would buy a few days' unity at the price of truth. He stared at them until the lines blurred. His hands hovered above the quills, trembling. "Chains of duty," Kel had said. "Break them and you fall. Keep them and they crush you." At last he signed one. The ink spread across the parchment like blood. When he sealed the order, he did not know whether he had saved Cadia or damned it. Only that the first betrayal was now his own. Outside, thunder rolled from the Eye of Terror, as if the galaxy itself bore witness. The day the siege truly began, the sky over Cadia tore open like a wound. From the heart of the Eye of Terror poured the Black Fleet's warships, jagged as broken teeth, their hulls veined with warp light. They moved in silence at first, a tide of iron shadows blotting out the stars. Then the void thundered with their guns, and the night above the fortress world became a burning tapestry of tracers and flame. For millennia, Cadia had stood as the bulwark. Now it was a bastion drowning in fire. Lord Castellan Varn stood in the command tower of Casa Vortigern, hands braced on the edge of the tactical table. Holo runes flickered as the first salvos struck the outer bastions. Casa Dravik gone dark, Casa Malin burning, Vox channels screaming and cutting off mid-word. Around him, officers shouted into headsets, data slates clattering like hail. Yet above it all, he heard only his own heartbeat, slow and heavy, and the whisper of his own doubts. The gate still held, but each order he gave felt like cutting pieces from his own flesh. Send the 23rd to reinforce the breach, knowing half would never return. Reroute artillery from the eastern wall, leaving it exposed. Every command weighed like ash in his mouth. He had signed his first betrayal in silence. Now the consequences marched at his heels. Captain Halden moved among the consoles, her voice steady even as the walls shook. She relayed orders, steadied officers, and kept her eyes away from his. Since her confession, a quiet distance had opened between them. He no longer knew if she was his truest ally or his next dagger. Yet, when her gaze did meet his, he saw the same hollow weariness he felt two soldiers bound by chains they could not drop. A blast shuddered through the tower. Dust rained from the ceiling, lights flickering. An officer cried out that Kasser Varen had fallen, its defences overwhelmed in minutes. Varn straightened slowly. "Hold the gate," he said, voice flat. "No retreats, no collapse. Hold it." He descended to the walls to see the battle himself. The air was a furnace of propellant and ozone. Overhead, the black fleets bled fire onto Cadia's surface. Below, ranks of soldiers fired until barrels glowed. The ground quaked with every impact, sending cracks through the stone like veins of darkness. Yet the Cadians did not break. They fought with the mechanical grace of those born to war, their discipline a wall against the tide. Varn walked among them, helmet under his arm, speaking few words. Some saluted, some only glanced up with eyes ringed in soot. He saw children carrying ammunition, priests moving from squad to squad, whispering litanies to a silent emperor. He wondered if any of them truly believed the prayers were heard. Beyond the smoke, he glimpsed Strass's forces, holding a sector of the inner defences, tight, disciplined, but suspiciously intact. He knew the general had built himself a sanctuary, yet here he stood fighting still. Was it loyalty or calculation? In war, there was little difference. Halden joined him on the parapet, las rifle slung across her back. "They're pushing harder on the western approach," she said. "Strass refuses to redeploy his reserves without your direct order." Varn's jaw clenched. "If I order him and he disobeys, the army splits." "Then what?" she asked. He stared at the horizon where the eye flared, casting its unholy light across the battlefield. "Then I find another way." Another shell slammed into the wall below, sending a tremor through the parapet. Halden steadied herself on the crenellation. "The men still believe in you," she said. He almost laughed. "Belief is just another blade. It cuts the one who carries it as surely as the enemy." She looked at him, eyes dark. "Then why keep carrying it?" He had no answer. Hours blurred. The black fleets rained destruction. Vox reports came of demonic incursions in the lower casas, of officers found dead at their posts, of entire squads vanishing into warp rifts, opening like mouths in the streets. Varn gave orders, shifted units, patched gaps. But each decision felt like pressing his fingers into a crumbling dam. The cracks widened faster than he could seal them. Near midnight, a courier brought news from the inner lines. One of his own lieutenants had deserted with a cache of munitions, heading towards Strass's perimeter. Varn felt a coldness settle over him. Even here, even now, the rot spread. He thought of Kell's words, of chains and damnation. He thought of the signature on the order he had given days before the compromise he had made to hold the illusion of unity. Perhaps this was its fruit. He dismissed the courier and went back to the parapet. The battlefield was a sea of fire now, silhouettes of soldiers etched against a sky of purple flame. The eye pulsed above them, vast and patient. Every friend could be a foe. Every oath could be a blade. Halden approached quietly. "If you mean to arrest Strass," she said, "do it soon." Each day he grows stronger behind his walls. Varn stared out at the gate. The lines of troops, like veins of light across the dark. If I arrest him, Cadia may tear itself apart in civil war. If I leave him, Cadia may fall to chaos. Either way, he let the words die. "You're not alone," she said softly. He turned to her, searching her face. "Aren't I?" She didn't answer. The warp light caught in her eyes, making them seem briefly alien. For a heartbeat he imagined the vision she had described, her standing over him with a blade. Perhaps this was how it began. Not with treachery, but with despair. He stepped back from the parapet, breathing the hot metallic air. Around them, the fortress walls trembled under the constant assault. In the distance, he saw Strass's banners still unbroken, a silent reminder of the choice waiting for him. He closed his eyes. The siege had begun, and with it, the slow peeling away of everything he had built: faith, loyalty, even self. Each order he gave was a cut, each hour a new scar. Above the gate, the eye flared again, casting its light over the bastions like a mockery of dawn. Varn opened his eyes and whispered to the wind, "Chains hold, chains break. Which will it be?" The wind did not answer. Only the thunder of war. Underscore, 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 underscore. The warp storms glowed even in darkness, staining the clouds with veins of green and violet. From the parapets of Casa Vortigern, the war seemed endless. Flickers of las fire far below, the dull thud of artillery, the hiss of Vox traffic thick with static. Yet Lord Castellan Varn had begun to feel that the real battle was no longer in the streets or on the walls. It crept instead through corridors, whispered behind doors, carried in sealed messages and missing names. He stood alone in the command tower, helm under his arm, staring at the hololith. Symbols of regiments blinked like stars across a green grid. Yet every few minutes, another winked out, delayed, diverted, lost. Not to daemons, but to something quieter. The pattern was unmistakable now. Convoys misdirected, reports falsified, a courier found murdered in an empty stairwell with no sign of forced entry. Halden entered without knocking. She had stopped trying to hide the shadows under her eyes. War and visions both had stripped her of polish. She placed a slate on the table between them. "Another leak," she said simply. "Details of tomorrow's counteroffensive transmitted to an unknown Vox node in the lower Casas. We're chasing ghosts." Varn did not look up. "Or we're chasing ourselves," he murmured. Halden hesitated. "What do you mean?" He touched one blinking rune on the hololith. "Chaos doesn't need to infiltrate us with daemons. It only needs to let us devour each other. Every time I try to move, the plan is already known. Every corridor hides another hand pulling at the threads. Perhaps the war is already lost, and I'm only commanding its corpse. She reached across the table, fingers brushing the edge of the slate but not his hand. You're not beaten yet. He almost smiled. Not yet. But the silence between reports feels like victory for someone else. They walked together down to the vaults where captured saboteurs were kept. The cells were mostly empty, those caught were found dead before interrogation. Poison, suicide, or something darker. The guards saluted stiffly as the Castellan passed, but he saw doubt flicker in their eyes. Everyone now suspected everyone. In one cell lay the courier murdered hours before, his body shrouded. Varn stared at the sheet as though it could answer him. He was carrying my seal, he said. If they can kill under that protection, what shield remains? Halden's voice was low. Do you think Strass? I think Strass. I think Kale. I think perhaps even myself. The words surprised him, but once spoken, they felt true. The eye whispers to all of us. Some listen. Some only breathe it in without knowing. I signed an order that betrayed my own oath. Perhaps that was the first breach. Halden did not reply. The torchlight cast her shadow long across the stones, almost merging with his. For an instant, he thought of her vision, her standing over him with a blade. He wondered if that moment was approaching. They returned to the upper levels, where the fortress trembled under bombardment. The war above roared like a storm, but within the spire the halls were hushed. Officers whispered at corners, glances darted away. Even the servitors seemed slower, as though infected by doubt. A runner arrived breathless, clutching a fresh slate. My lord, the fleet from Segmentum Obscurus has been delayed again. Their astropaths report unexpected disturbances. No arrival before dawn. Varn took the slate and dismissed the boy. When he looked at the screen, he saw more than a delay. He saw a noose tightening. Without those ships, his planned counterattack would falter. Yet the information had reached the enemy already. Their raids were striking precisely where his forces weakened. He pressed the slate flat on the table until the casing cracked. Every delay another blade, he said. Halden leaned close. You can still strike first. Pull reserves from Strass. Hit the cult cells before dawn. If I pull reserves from Strass, Varn cut in, I hand him the excuse he needs to brand me tyrant. The army splits. Cadia falls. If I don't, the leaks continue and Cadia falls anyway. Her jaw tightened. Then what choice is left? He turned toward the window where the warp light flickered like a dying star, only to keep moving, as though the war is still ours. Later, as he walked the corridors alone, he heard fragments of conversation die at his approach. A pair of junior officers saluted too quickly. A tech adept slipped a data chip into a sleeve. Every gesture seemed a signal, every silence the plot. The fortress felt hollow, as though its stone had been replaced by ash. In the chapel of the spire, he paused. Rows of candles guttered in the warp-tainted breeze, casting trembling halos across the aquila above the altar. Soldiers knelt in silence, lips moving without sound. He remembered kneeling like that as a boy, whispering prayers drilled into him before he even understood their meaning. Now he wondered if anyone listened at all. Marshal Kell's words echoed in his mind. Loyalty is a chain, but some chains hold the world together. He tried to imagine those chains now, links rusting, breaking one by one. What remained to hold Cadia when the last link snapped? A Vox officer hurried to him, voice low. Intercepted message, my lord. Origin unknown. It names you. Varn took the transcript. The words were simple. The gate is already lost. He just hasn't seen it yet. No signature, only a sigil of a broken eye burned into the parchment. He crumpled it in his fist, feeling the ink smear like soot. Was it a taunt from chaos or a whisper from within? He no longer knew. Back in his quarters, he found Halden waiting. She stood at the window, her back to him. "It's spreading," she said without turning. Men whisper of surrender, others of revolt. Even the priests question whether the emperor watches. The true war isn't on the walls anymore. It's here. She touched her chest. Inside. He moved to stand beside her. And if the inside falls, the outside won't matter. She looked at him then, eyes hollow but steady. "You're still fighting. That's enough." "Is it?" he asked. Outside the window, the warp storm flared, casting their reflections in ghostly light. For a moment, he thought he saw his own face as it appeared in her vision eyes, not his own. Skin like stone. He blinked, and it was gone. He turned from the glass. "Prepare contingency plans," he said. "If the leaks continue, we'll shift to cell. Command no one officer holding the whole picture. At least then the enemy will have fragments, not the whole blade." She nodded slowly. "That will make us harder to coordinate. It will make us harder to betray." When she left, the room fell silent, except for the distant thunder of guns. Varn sat at his desk, staring at the map of Cadia, etched into brass. He traced the lines of the gate with one finger, feeling the grooves like scars. In his mind, he saw it already broken, the eye spilling through. Not a prophecy, not a threat, just inevitability. He whispered to the empty room. "Maybe I lost long before the first shot was fired." The brass under his hand felt cold as a tomb. Casa Vortigern trembled under a bombardment that felt like the heartbeat of some buried god. Shocks rattled through the command spire, loosening dust from ancient beams, making data slates flicker and stutter. Yet inside the war room, it was not the thunder of the siege that chilled Lord Castellan Varn. It was the silence. His senior staff stood gathered around the hololith, the eye of terror glowing at its center like a malignant Sunday. Master Ariston Kale, the overseer from Terra, stood at the far end of the table with hands folded in his black and gold robes. His face was composed, his eyes too calm. For weeks, Varn had suspected. Supply chains cut without warning, reinforcements promised and never sent. Orders from Terra that made no tactical sense. Now, with the city's arteries clogged by sabotage and its heart battered by the siege, the shape of betrayal stood revealed before him. "Kale," Varn said quietly, "tell them what you told me." The overseer inclined his head. His voice was smooth, unhurried. "Very well. Cadia was never meant to survive this war." Murmurs erupted around the table. A junior officer half rose before Varn's glance froze him in place. Kale went on as though reading from scripture. "The High Lords decreed this campaign. A delaying action. The fortress world is a pawn to be spent. We are here to hold until the real defenses behind us are completed. Reinforcements were never coming. Every message I carried from Terra was a fiction, meant to keep you fighting." Varn felt something tear inside him. Not a physical wound, but a bond snapping. The Aquila banners on the wall seemed suddenly like shrouds. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low. "I obeyed," Kale replied. "I was sent to ensure you obeyed as well." Halden stood at Varn's shoulder, her fists trembling. "You condemned an entire world," she hissed. Kale's eyes flicked to her, almost pitying. "The Imperium condemns worlds every day. Cadia is only another name on the ledger." Varn's breath came slow and heavy. Rage burned up from his stomach like acid, but beneath it lay something colder: recognition. He had fought all his life, believing loyalty was a shield. Now, he saw it as a leash. The Emperor's throne had not simply abandoned them, it had used them. "You should have told us," he said. "We could have chosen our deaths with our eyes open." Cale tilted his head. "Would you? Or would you have done exactly what you're doing now, standing, fighting, bleeding because you know no other way?" The words struck like blows. Varn's hands curled on the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. He thought of the children drilling with wooden rifles, of Marshal Kell's voice in the Hall of Oaths, of Strass building his private sanctuary. All pawns, all sacrifices, all for a throne that watched in silence. And then, like a tide seeping through a crack, the other voice came. It was not Cale's voice, nor Haldan's, but the whisper he had heard in his dreams for months, the whisper of the Eye. "They have abandoned you. We have not." He saw it not with his eyes, but with his mind. A vision of himself, standing upon the ruins of Cadia, immortal and unbowed, his flesh transfigured into something impervious, chains broken, banners of black and green rising behind him, no longer a pawn but a weapon, no longer a mortal, but a sentinel who would never be deceived again. The vision faded, leaving him trembling. Haldan's hand brushed his arm, anchoring him. "My lord." He straightened slowly. "Everyone out," he said. The officers hesitated. Cale arched an eyebrow. "Out!" Varn barked. The word cracked like a bolt round. The staff scattered, leaving only Haldan and Cale. Varn stepped around the table until he stood before the overseer. "You came to keep me fighting. You succeeded, but you also came to keep me obedient. That ends now." Cale did not flinch. "You are still bound by oath, Castellan." Varn almost laughed. "An oath to what?" "A throne that feeds us to the Eye. You think loyalty survives that? Without loyalty, you are nothing," Cale said softly. "You become what you fight," the whisper returned. "Or you become what you must." For an instant, Varn saw his gauntlet rise, saw himself striking Cale down, ending the charade, seizing command. But the movement remained in his mind. To kill him here would not free Cadia. It would only shatter what little unity remained. Haldan spoke into the taut silence. "What now, my lord?" Varn's eyes stayed locked on Cale. "Now we hold, but on our own terms. No more false orders from Terra. No more pawns." Cale's expression flickered the first crack in his composure. "You risk excommunication, Castellan." Varn turned away, the whisper of immortality curling like smoke around his thoughts. "You risk nothing. You gain everything. Take our gift. Survive." He gripped the window ledge, staring out at the burning horizon. "I have risked everything already," he murmured. Behind him, Cale shifted as if to speak, but Haldan stepped between them. "Leave," she said to the overseer, "before the next word you speak costs you your life." Cale's robes whispered as he turned and departed. When the door shut, Varn let out a breath that felt like ash. "If we cannot win as we are, then we lose as ourselves," she finished. He looked at her, searching for anger, but found only exhaustion and a flicker of fear. "Would you still follow me?" he asked. "If I chose another path?" She hesitated. "I swore an oath to Cadia, not to Terra, but I won't follow a daemon lord, my lord." He almost smiled. "Then perhaps you will have to keep me human." Outside, the warp storm flared, throwing jagged light across their faces. Varn closed his eyes. The chains of duty lay broken at his feet, yet he could still feel their weight. Immortality whispered again, vengeance, survival, freedom from betrayal. All it required was surrender. He opened his eyes and whispered to no one. Not yet. The storm answered with silence. The sky above Cadia split like torn canvas. Warp light poured through in sheets of violet and sickly green, spilling across the fortress world, as if reality itself had been ripped open. Fleets that had held the line for weeks were swallowed whole. Vast battleships vanished into storms that moved like living things, their hulls dissolving into sparks and screams. From the walls of Casa Vortigern, Lord Castellan Varn watched the heavens convulse and thought, "The sky is falling, and with it everything I believed in." The fortress trembled under bombardment. Stone groaned, iron cracked. Banners whipped in winds that stank of ozone and blood. Soldiers fought on the ramparts like figures carved from shadow, firing into a storm they could scarcely see. Yet Varn's mind was no longer on the enemy beyond the walls. It was on the enemy within, and on the man who waited for him in the depths of the casa. He descended stair after stair, until the thunder of the siege became a distant pulse. Below the command spire lay a vaulted chamber, lit by emergency lumens, their glow flickering like dying stars. At its center stood General Strass, unarmored for the first time Varn had ever seen him, his medals stripped from his chest. Only a simple officer's coat remained, its dark cloth dusted with ash. In his hands he held no weapon, yet the air around him felt like a blade. "You came," Strass said softly. Varn stopped several paces away. "I told you to remain under guard." Strass's mouth curved in a shadow of a smile. "Your guards chose to let me go. Everyone chooses now. No one believes in orders anymore." The walls shook as another salvo struck above, showering dust into the light. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the storm outside a chorus to their confrontation. "You diverted my regiments," Varn said at last. "You built yourself a sanctuary while Cadia burned." "I built a future," Strass replied. "You built a tomb." Varn's fists clenched at his sides. "You've killed us all." "No," Strass said, stepping closer. "I've kept alive what can still be saved. I told you before, reinforcements would never come. Terra has abandoned us. You know this now. You heard it from Kael himself. The Emperor's throne will watch us die and call it victory." Varn's breath came hard. "So your answer is surrender?" "Not surrender," Strass said. "Survival. The Eye offers terms. We stand aside at the chosen hour, open the corridors, lay down our arms. In return, Cadia remains. Our people live. We become something new." Lightning flared through a crack in the ceiling, casting both men's shadows huge upon the walls. One hunched, one upright, two figures like opposing statues. Varn took a step forward, voice low. "Something new? You mean something not human?" Strass did not flinch. "Humanity has abandoned us. Why should we cling to it? We could be eternal, stronger, free from betrayal." Varn felt the whisper again, curling in his skull like smoke. "You could be eternal." He saw for a heartbeat the same vision Halden had described. Himself immortal at the gate, flesh like stone, eyes not his own. The temptation was no longer distant. It breathed against his neck. "You've already taken their bargain," he said quietly. Strass's eyes glimmered. "I've taken nothing yet. I waited for you. I want you beside me when the hour comes. You're the soul of Cadia. With you, the rest will follow." Above them, the storm roared louder, as if the Eye itself listened. The floor trembled, cracks spidering through the stone. Varn's gauntlets scraped together as he clenched his hands. "You think me your ally in damnation?" he asked. "I think you tired of being a pawn," Strass said. "I think you signed that order weeks ago, knowing it was a betrayal. You've already stepped onto this path. Why not walk it to its end?" Varn's heart pounded. He thought of Halden, of Kale, of the child soldier with the splintered rifle. He thought of Kale's smooth confession, of the Emperor's silence. The chains of duty lay broken. All that remained was the choice. The walls shook again, a section collapsing in a shower of dust. Firelight poured through, bathing the chamber in a crimson glow. It felt like standing in the heart of the eye itself. Strass extended a hand. "Come with me. When the gate falls, we will not. We will rise." Varn stared at the hand, the glow painting it like molten metal. The whisper of immortality surged inside him. Vengeance, survival, freedom from betrayal. All it required was surrender. He stepped forward until only a pace separated them. Words rose in his throat, sharp as blades. "I swore an oath," he said. "To what?" Strass demanded. "To terror? To a corpse on a throne? Or to Cadia? If to Cadia, then choose life for it. Choose strength." Varn's eyes burned. "You speak of life but mean slavery. You speak of strength but mean corruption. You've already betrayed Cadia once. Don't dress it as mercy." Strass's jaw tightened. "This is the last chance, Dearus. Come with me. Save what can be saved, or watch it burn and know it's on your hands." The chamber shook violently. Flames licked through the cracks. Outside, fleets died screaming in the sky. Varn felt the heat on his face, felt the whisper coil like a serpent around his heart. He saw two futures, one where he clasped Strass's hand and became something eternal, one where he stood alone and watched Cadia die. He drew in a breath that tasted of ash. "I will not kneel," he said. Strass's hand fell. "Then you will fall." They stood, locked in silence, as the ceiling cracked wider, warp light spilling like blood. Words had cut deeper than any blade. There was no offer left, no friendship, no bond. Only war. Varn turned and walked toward the stair, each step an effort of will. Behind him, Strass's voice rose over the storm, neither a threat nor a plea, but something colder. "When you break," he called, "remember I offered you a way out." Varn did not look back. Outside, the sky had become a whirlpool of fire, fleets devoured like drifting leaves. He climbed to the parapet and stared into the storm, his hands trembling. The chains of duty weighed heavier than ever, but he still bore them. For now, he whispered to the burning horizon, "Cadia stands." The wind swallowed the words, carrying them into the shattered sky. Cadia burned like a pyre. From the walls of Castle Vortigern, Lord Castellan Varn watched the fortress city he had sworn to protect dissolve into flame and warp light. Entire districts had collapsed under orbital strikes. Streets where he had walked as a child were now chasms filled with screaming fire. Yet the true collapse was not in the stone, it was in him. He stood in the command chamber, surrounded by maps that no longer reflected reality. Regiments blinked out of existence on the hololith, their signals lost to void storms or betrayal. Reports arrived of daemons pouring through breaches, of priests dragged into the sky by unseen claws, of Strass's forces withdrawing deeper into their sanctuary. And through it all, the whisper of immortality pressed against Varn's skull like a blade of ice. "You can end this. You can endure. Halden stood across the table, helmet under her arm, face pale from exhaustion. She had served him without question for years, defied Kale, risked death for her visions. She was the last link of loyalty he still trusted. And yet she was also the one he feared most now. In her dreams, she had seen herself over him with a blade. In his, he had seen himself immortal and hollow. Between them hung a silence thicker than the storm. "My lord," she said quietly, "the eastern bastions are gone. We can't hold the gate much longer." "I know," he murmured. "We need to act." Her eyes searched his. "We can still strike at Strasse's bunker, force him to release his reserves. Or we can cut losses and pull back to the inner cassers. But standing here..." She shook her head. "Standing here we die." Varn looked at her and felt something twist inside him. She was right. Standing here, they would die. But striking Strasse openly would ignite civil war in the middle of the siege. Pulling back would cede the gate entirely. Every path was ruin. Unless, the whisper came again, clearer now, give her up. Offer her. Break the chain. He turned away from her, staring at the burning horizon through the cracked window. "If we move on Strasse," he said slowly, "his men will fight us instead of chaos. We lose the gate faster." "Then let me go," Halden said. "I'll take a kill team myself." He spun back to her. "Number, you're the only officer I can still trust." Her mouth tightened. "Then what is left?" He hesitated, the decision forming like frost. There was one way to hold the army together for a little longer. One way to stop Strasse from openly seizing control. But it meant giving Kale, and by extension Terra, a scapegoat. Someone to blame for the leaks, the visions, the whispers. Someone whose removal would reassure the doubting officers. Halden watched him, reading his silence. "You're thinking of something," she said. He swallowed hard. "I'm thinking of survival." "Survival for who?" she asked. He could not answer. The next hour blurred. Orders signed, sealed, delivered. Guards summoned. The war room empty, except for the echo of his footsteps. Outside, Cadia's sky cracked open further, spilling daemons across the bastions like ink. When Halden returned from a perimeter inspection, 2 guards stepped from the shadows and barred her path. She looked from them to Varn, confusion flashing into realization. "Dearus," she whispered. Varn forced himself to meet her eyes. "Captain Serica Halden," he said formally. "By authority of the Castellan, you are placed under arrest for collaboration with enemy forces." The words burned his throat like acid. She stared at him, motionless. "Collaboration? Your visions, your unauthorized movements, the leaks." His voice was iron, but his hands shook behind his back. "The officers are losing faith. They need an answer. You are that answer." For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then she laughed once, a sound without humor. "You think this will save Cadia? It may hold it together long enough to matter," he said. She stepped toward him, but the guards blocked her. "You're betraying me to keep your illusion alive," she said quietly. "But you're only finishing what the eye began." Varn's jaw clenched. "Take her to the lower cells," he ordered. "No harm is to come to her." As the guards led her away, she turned her head once. "In my vision," she said softly, "I stood over you with a blade. I think now it wasn't me killing you. It was you killing yourself." The words cut deeper than any weapon. When she was gone, Varn sank into the chair at the head of the table. His armor felt like stone, his heart like ash. Outside, Cadia burned, but the real fire was inside him, hollowing him out. He had given up the last person who believed in him. He had become his own prophecy, immortal in chains, alone at the gate. Cale entered quietly, expression unreadable. "The officers are reassured," he said. "They believe you've rooted out the traitor." Vaughn did not look up. "Do they?" "They do. Morale rises. Orders are being obeyed again." Vaughn closed his eyes. The whisper of immortality slid closer, almost gentle. "This is the path. Each bond you break makes you stronger. Take our gift, and no betrayal can touch you." He opened his eyes to the burning horizon. "At what cost?" he murmured. No one answered. Casa Vortigern was no longer a fortress, but a carcass. Its walls still rose, but every stone leaked fire. Its bastions still fired, but their muzzles glowed like dying stars. Beyond the parapets, the gate itself cracked under the weight of the storm. Fissures of warp light crawling across the sky, like veins in shattered glass. Each detonation shook the world, and with it, Lord Castellan Vaughn's soul. He walked the upper corridors alone, boots echoing on soot-slick stone. Guards averted their eyes. Officers saluted without conviction. Since Halden's arrest, the command had grown obedient. But obedience felt like a tomb. Messages from the lower casas spoke of desertions, mutinies crushed by silent firing squads. Priests found strangled in their shrines. Even Marshal Kell no longer answered his summons. Allies had become shadows retreating beyond his reach. In the quiet between bombardments, the whisper returned, soft as breath against his ear. "You have done all that loyalty could do. Now take what we offer. Be more than mortal. Stand when all else falls." He paused at a window shattered by concussion. Outside, warp storms devoured the fleets above Cadia. Fragments of once proud battleships fell burning through the clouds, their debris streaking like meteors toward the fortress world. He imagined himself among them, falling, burning, ending as a brief flare of light. Then he imagined the other path, standing forever at the gate, unchanging, a sentinel forged from betrayal and loss. Immortality without self, chains without flesh. The vision lingered as he entered the war room. Cale stood at the table, robes immaculate even amid ruin. "The cracks widen," the overseer said calmly. "The eye will soon pour through, if you have hidden reserves, Castellan. Now is the time." Vaughn's gaze moved across the hololith, where entire sectors blinked dead. "There are no reserves left," he said. "Only choices." Cale's eyes flickered. "You sound like Strass." Vaughn did not answer. He had not seen Strass in days. The general's bunker was sealed behind concentric rings of his own troops. Yet rumors filtered through negotiations with unseen envoys. His men marked by strange sigils, weapons, shipments disappearing into tunnels. Perhaps Strass had already crossed the threshold. Perhaps he waited for Vaughn to follow. The whisper slid closer. "He is gone. You can still stand. Take our gift. Protect what remains." Vaughn closed his eyes. "What remains?" he murmured. When he opened them again, Cale was watching him with faint curiosity. "You look tired, Castellan. Cadia requires strength. Cadia requires truth," Vaughn said. "And truth is that we are dying." The overseer's mouth curved faintly. "Then die as you must." Vaughn turned away. His armor felt heavier than stone. He thought of Halden in her cell, of her words. "You're killing yourself." He thought of the child with the splintered rifle, of Kell's chains of duty. Each step he had taken, meant to save Cadia, had only stripped another layer of himself. What was left now but a shell in armor? A voice giving orders no one believed. That night, he went down into the lower cells alone. The guards stepped aside without question. Their eyes no longer met his. He found Holden sitting against the wall, hands bound, eyes clear. She looked up at him without surprise. "Has it all fallen?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. She tilted her head. "But you have." Her words struck but did not wound. He had grown too numb. "There is still a chance," he said softly. "One act, one choice. And Cadia survives. Not as it is, but as something stronger." Her expression tightened. "Strass's path. My path," he corrected, though the word felt false. "If I take it, no more betrayals, no more chains." "You mean no more self," she said. He looked at her through the bars. "Would you rather see everyone die?" She did not flinch. "Better to die as ourselves than live as what they would make us." Varn closed his eyes. The whisper came again, now warm as blood. "They will all die. Only you can hold the gate. Only you can rise." He turned from her without another word. At dawn, the gate cracked audibly, a deep groan like a world breaking. Warp fire bled through the fissures, igniting the clouds in curtains of green flame. Regiments faltered under the onslaught. Vox traffic dissolved into static. Varn stood on the parapet and gave orders with a voice he barely recognized. He pulled troops from the eastern wall to reinforce the western breach, leaving whole sectors naked. Civilians were pressed into last-ditch labor, wounded soldiers sent back to the line without Medicae. Each command felt like another betrayal of the ideals he had once carried. Cale watched from the tower with cool detachment. Officers obeyed without question, but their eyes were hollow. Even Marshal Kell's banner fell that day, its company, overrun when promised support never came. By evening, Varn felt stripped to bone. He had clung to hope, to the idea that each sacrifice would buy a future. Yet each step deeper only proved the futility of ambition. The gate was cracking, and so was he. On the 9th hour of bombardment, he stood once more at the shattered window, warp light painting his armor in sickly hues. The whisper rose within him like a tide. "This is the moment. Take it. Be ours and stand forever." He pressed his hands to the sill, fingers digging into stone. "If I do," he whispered, "what remains of me?" The storm answered, with a roar that shook the walls. Behind him came the sound of a door opening. Cale's voice, soft and cold. "The time has come, Castellan. Choose." Varn did not turn. Outside, Cadia burned. Inside, he was already ash. The walls of Casa Vortigern split under the weight of the storm. Stones older than memory sheared away, tumbling into fire. Warp light poured through the cracks like molten glass, twisting the air into screaming shapes. Beyond the parapets, the gate yawned open, a wound in space from which poured not fleets but living darkness. Daemons clawed their way into reality in tides, their bodies flickering between form and nightmare. Cadia was no longer a fortress world. It was the front step of hell. Lord Castellan Varn stood at the heart of the command spire, hands braced on the table as the hololith disintegrated under static. Regiments winked out like dying stars. Orders vanished into the void. The last bastions were falling, yet the war inside him burned hotter. In his veins ran exhaustion, rage, and the whisper of immortality promising to hold him upright when all else fell. Halden's cell lay shattered below the outer walls, breached by bombardment. She had been freed by the chaos of impact. No message from her, no sign she still lived. Varn's mind clung to her absence like a wound. He had betrayed her to hold the army together. Now, the army was ash. Only his betrayal remained. Strass waited for him in the ruins of the inner courtyard. The general had shed his officer's coat for black armor etched with symbols Varn did not recognize. Around him clustered his remaining troops, eyes shining faintly green in the warp light. They made no move to attack. They only watched as their leaders approached one another across a floor cracked like a dried riverbed. "You waited," Varn said, voice low. Strass inclined his head. "I told you this moment would come." Above them the sky convulsed, pouring ships and daemons into flame. Sections of the wall collapsed in slow motion, stone blocks tumbling like falling stars. The noise was endless. Yet in the courtyard it felt like silence, as though time had drawn a circle around them. "You took their bargain," Varn said. "I took survival," Strass answered. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim. "And I offer it again. Even now you can stand beside me. Cadia can live through us." Varn stepped closer. "Cadia dies the moment we surrender What-It Island." Strass's smile was a thin blade. "Cadia already died. You saw to that when you sacrificed your captain, when you signed orders that stripped your own ideals. You're not the Castellan anymore. You're just another pawn who doesn't know which side he serves." The words cut deeper than the warp wind. Varn felt himself sway, memories rushing Halden's gaze through the bars. Kel's warning, the child with the splintered rifle. He had indeed broken every chain he swore to keep. What remained now but to finish the path or die on it? Lightning struck the courtyard, carving a trench between them. Warp fire rose like a curtain, its shapes forming grotesque wings that flapped without sound. Through the flames, Varn saw himself as in a mirror, Strass with glowing eyes, himself with hollow ones. Two faces of the same ruin. Strass extended a gauntleted hand. "Take it. This is the last chance. With you beside me, the Eye will grant Cadia a future. Without you, it will devour everything." The whisper surged within Varn, no longer soft but thunderous. "Take it. Rise. Be more than mortal." He felt his knees tremble, not from fear but from the weight of temptation. To clasp Strass's hand was to end the agony, to survive, to stand immortal over ashes. To refuse was to die, and to watch everyone else die too. He closed his eyes. Chains of duty. Break them and you fall. Keep them and they crush you. Perhaps there was no difference anymore. When he opened his eyes, he saw movement at the edge of the courtyard. Halden stood there, blood streaking her face, one arm bound with a torn bandage. She had a rifle, but did not raise it. She only looked at him, no plea, no accusation, only waiting to see which man he would be. Varn's breath caught. This was the choice, not between life and death, but between becoming what he hated or dying as himself. He stepped forward, but not towards Strass, toward Halden. Strass's face darkened. "Fool," he hissed. Varn drew his sidearm. "No more offers. You can't kill me," Strass said. "You're already one of us." Varn's finger tightened on the trigger. "No," he said softly. "I'm just a man." He fired. The shot struck Strass's chest, staggering him. Warp light flared from the wound, green and black spilling like smoke. His troops screamed not in pain but in fury as the link between them shuddered. Strass lurched forward, eyes blazing. "You've doomed them all," he gasped. "You've doomed yourself." "I know," Varn whispered, and fired again. The second shot shattered the symbols on Strass's armor. Warp fire burst upward, engulfing him in silent flame. His body dissolved into ash that the storm snatched away. For a heartbeat, the courtyard was still. Then the daemons roared, and the gate cracked open wider. spewing darkness across the walls. Halden limped toward him. "You chose," she said. Varn lowered the gun. His hands shook. "I chose," he echoed. "But it changes nothing. The walls are falling," she said. "I know." Above them, the fortress collapsed in slow waves. Bastions crumbling, banners torn into spirals of smoke, vox channels dissolved into static. The eye poured through without resistance now. Varn looked at Halden, at the ruins of his world, and felt nothing left inside but ash. He had killed his rival, broken his oaths, betrayed his captain, betrayed himself. Immortality still whispered, but it sounded distant now, almost bored. "Too late," it murmured. "You could have stood. Now you will fall." He turned back to the storm. "So be it," he said. Halden put a hand on his arm. "What now?" "Now," he said, "we hold what we can, for as long as we can. Not for terror, not for survival. Just because Cadia stands until it doesn't." Another section of the wall collapsed, sending up a plume of dust. They stood together in the courtyard as the storm closed in, two figures against an ocean of darkness. Choices had been made, sacrifices taken. The end had begun. Cadia's sky had turned a colour no name could hold, neither violet nor green, but a living bruise of light and shadow. Warp storms spiraled down like black serpents, striking the bastions with hammer blows that cracked stone and bent steel. Whole casas had vanished overnight. Streets where the Cadian creed had been drilled for generations were now trenches of fire. Yet for Lord Castellan Varn, the worst blow did not come from the eye. It came from within. He stood in the ruined war room, boots planted amid shattered glass and curling smoke. The hololith was dead. Maps scattered across the table, like fragments of a broken oath. Around him, the last officers whispered and withdrew, unable to meet his gaze. Only one figure remained, Marshal Ardent Kell, his old mentor, leaning heavily on a bent cane, greatcoat stiff with ash. For a heartbeat, Varn felt a flicker of solace at the sight. Here was the man who had carved discipline into his bones, who had taught him that chains could hold the world together. "Kell," he said, voice rough. "You came." "I came because it ends," the old marshal replied. His eyes were bright and wet, not with tears but with something sharper. "And because you must know before the last wall falls." Varn's stomach tightened. "Know what?" "That Cadia was lost before the siege began," Kell said softly. "Lost by my hand." The words landed like a shell in the silent room. Varn stared, unable to move. Kell straightened, cane tapping once against the floor. "I was Terra's first knife here, long before Kale. When the High Lords decided Cadia would be a pawn, they needed someone to shape its fall. I built the cracks you've been trying to mend. I delayed reinforcements, doctored reports, planted men in your councils. I told myself it was to spare Cadia worse. I told myself it was duty." Varn's vision blurred. "You raised me to loyalty. I raised you to obedience," Kell said. "I thought you would hold Cadia just long enough for Terra to finish its walls behind you. But you held longer than they wanted. You almost ruined the plan. So they sent Kale to tighten the leash." The room tilted. Varn reached for the table to steady himself. All the betrayals, all the whispers, woven not by strangers, but by the man who had been closer than blood. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Kell's eyes flickered with shame. "Because I watched you break your captain to keep Cadia standing. I watched you become me, and I could not let you die without knowing whose shadow you've walked in." Outside, Another bastion collapsed with a thunder that shook the spire. Dust drifted through the broken window like ash snow. Varn looked at his hands as though expecting blood to appear there. You made me a weapon and threw me away. I made you what Cadian needed, Kel said. And still you stood longer than I deserved. That is your greatness and your curse. Varn lifted his eyes, and for the first time in his life he felt no chain at all, only a void where faith had been. The eye whispered in the emptiness, gentle as breath. All chains break, all truths rot. Come to us and stand beyond betrayal. He took a step toward Kel. And now, do you ask forgiveness? The old marshal bowed his head. I ask you to choose something better than I did. My choices killed a world. Yours can still save something. The whisper deepened, curling like smoke around Varn's heart. Kill him. Take us. Rise. Only power endures. He stood trembling between the ghost of his mentor and the promise of eternity. You handed Cadia to the enemy, he said, and still you stand here. Because even a traitor can face his end, Kel murmured. Another detonation rocked the spire. A crack split the floor between them. Through it rose a faint green glow from the warp storm below, lighting their faces like figures in a cathedral of ruin. Varn's voice was low. I have nothing left to believe in. Then believe in this, Kel said. Every step deeper into their promise erases you. I took it piece by piece, first my ideals, then my honor, then my soul. You have one piece left, keep it. Varn closed his eyes. He saw Halden somewhere in the chaos, still fighting or already dead. He saw Strass dissolving into warp fire. He saw his own reflection in the cracked window, eyes hollow, armor scorched, a man unmade. The whisper swelled. We can make you whole, immortal. Beyond shame, he opened his eyes. And if I refuse, then you die as yourself, Kel said. But at least you die free. For a long moment, Varn could not move. The spire groaned, the gate cracked wider. Daemons poured across the bastions like black water. Around them, the last lights of Cadia flickered. The whisper pressed harder. Choose. We are waiting. Varn stepped forward until he stood within arm's reach of Kel. His hand hovered at his sidearm. Chains of duty, chains of betrayal, chains of hope, all gone. Only ash remained. You were closer than blood, he said softly. I was your chain, Kel replied. Varn drew in a breath that tasted of smoke and endings. Then this is the last link. He did not draw his weapon. Instead, he turned toward the shattered window, looking out at the burning sky. You've taken enough, he said. I won't finish your work for you. Kel's cane slipped against the cracked floor. Then what will you do? Varn watched the gate split open, warp light flooding the horizon. I don't know, he whispered. But whatever it is, it will be mine. Behind him, the old marshal bowed his head, a tremor running through his shoulders. Outside, Cadia screamed under the weight of the storm. Inside, Varn felt the last fragments of belief fall away like embers from a dying fire. The tragedy was complete, only the ending remained. The sun over Cadia dimmed to an ember. It hung low above the horizon. Its light filtered through warp clouds until it resembled a dying eye, half-lidded and red, where once fortress cities had risen like teeth of black stone. Only craters smoked, their edges glowing like the rings of a brand. The gate stood open, not a bulwark, but a wound. From it poured the tide daemons, black fleets, the warp's unending hunger filling the world with a silence so complete it drowned the thunder of guns. Lord Castellan Varn walked alone across the inner courtyard of Casa Vortigern. Around him, the bastion's last walls crumbled, stones older than any record falling into pits of green fire. His armor was scorched, his cloak burned to tatters, his sidearm empty. In the sky above, banners of warp light unfurled like mocking litanies. Every step he took left a print in ash. He had lost everything but choice. Stras's ashes scattered on the wind. Holden vanished into the chaos. Whether dead, escaped, or transformed, he did not know. Kell's confession had left a hollow where his heart had been. Terror had abandoned them. The Eye had devoured them, and his own decisions had stripped him of the last fragments of self. The whisper of immortality still coiled around him like smoke, promising to make him whole. To stand unbowed when Cadia was only memory. One step, it murmured. One word, and you are ours. The gate will be your throne. The empire that betrayed you will tremble at your name. Varn reached the shattered steps of the silent gate, the inner arch where the Cadian creed had once been carved. The words were scorched away now, leaving only jagged grooves like teeth marks. He placed his palm against the stone and felt it shudder under the pressure of the warp beyond. It was warm, almost pulsing, as though the Eye itself waited behind a thin veil. He saw in his mind two visions. In one, he stepped through and rose immortal. A sentinel forged of betrayal and loss, guarding nothing but his own unending fury. In the other, he stood and died. His body crushed under the tide, but his soul, his own. Both futures ended in silence. Behind him, the fortress gave its final groan. Towers tilted, collapsing inward like closing fingers. Vox traffic dissolved into static. Even the daemons paused, as if savouring the moment before the last bastion fell. Varn spoke aloud, his voice rough. Cadia stands. It was no longer a battle cry, only a statement, as factual and doomed as the dying sun above. The whisper surged. Cadia falls. But you need not. He closed his eyes. Chains of duty. Chains of betrayal. Every link had broken. Only one chain remained. The one he had forged himself. The refusal to become what he hated. Perhaps it was futile. Perhaps it was only another kind of vanity. But it was his. He opened his eyes and stepped onto the threshold of the gate. Warp light licked at his boots, curling up like green flame. His armor cracked under invisible pressure. Blood trickled from his ears. Still, he stood. I will not kneel, he whispered. Not to terror. Not to you. The whisper hissed, turning sharp. Then die. I will, he said. But I will die as myself. He drew his blade, not a relic, not a daemon weapon, only the standard-issue sword of a Cadian officer, and planted it into the stone at his feet. The act was small, almost meaningless amid the roar of the warp. Yet the gesture rippled outward like a pebble in water. For an instant, the tide slowed, as though confused. Varn raised his face to the dying Sunday. In its red glow, he saw not glory, but an ending he could accept. A crumbling fortress, a fading empire, a man unmade, but still his own. The warp surged again, green fire cascading across the courtyard. The arch of the silent gate collapsed behind him, its stones falling like broken wings. The tide swept forward, swallowing everything. For a heartbeat, Varn stood at the center of ruin, a solitary figure framed by fire and silence. No chains bound him now, no oaths, no promises, only the choice he had made. Then, the wave struck. The last thing he saw was the sun dimming to black. as if an eyelid closed over the galaxy. The last thing he felt was the weight lifting from his shoulders. The last sound was not a scream but a sigh, as Cadia, world of chains, world of loyalty, slipped into silence. The gate stood open, empty, the sentinel gone,